So in this video, we're going to talk about how much cash you're actually going to need at the closing or at the closing table when you purchase your home and right before you get the keys and you're able to move in. How much cash are you going to need? So it's a very simple formula, and all we're going to do is we're going to add together two different items, and then we're going to subtract three items, and that's going to get you your total amount that you're going to need for your loan closing and for your purchase. So the first one you've probably already thought about is your down payment and what amount you're going to need. So if you remember from the previous video, we talked about the 5 different types of loans, and 3 of those 5 likely required a down payment of some sort, either 3% down, 3.5%, 5%, 10%, 20%, whatever that number is. And you've probably got some ability to put more down if you'd like and rearrange some terms, but whatever that minimum amount is, that's going to be your down payment requirement for that particular loan program. So we're just going to use an amount right now of we'll call it 5%. So a 5% down payment on a, we'll call it $300,000 home would be $15,000, okay? Then you've got your closing costs, and this one's going to be affected a little bit by the loan program that you choose as well. A nice rule of thumb is typically about 2 to 3% of your purchase price is going to be the amount you're going to have in closing costs. So that's things like an origination fee, appraisal, title work, title insurance, closing fee at the title company, a survey on the property, and then paying your first full year of insurance on the property, properly funding that escrow account to pay those taxes and insurance as they come through. Just for this video and for ease of understanding, it's we'll just say it's 3% of your purchase price. So that same $300,000 purchase, we're going to say another 3% of that would be another $9,000 needed for closing costs. That may be a little on the high side, and as you go up in price, that percentage-wise is a little bit less, but that'll give you a rule of thumb, okay? So far we've got a down payment requirement of 5% on this particular fake loan scenario, and then we've got 3% needed for closing costs. So we're going to need 8% of that purchase price at closing up until this point. So $300,000 times 8%, we're going to need about $24,000. However, there's going to be things that will reduce that number actually needed from you out of pocket. So the first one, and this depends a lot on the market and the seller and just the overall offer that you put in on the home. The seller from time to time will actually help contribute to those closing costs. So if the seller is very motivated and willing to help out, they may give you a credit of, let's say 3% of that purchase price to then help cover your closing costs. So instead of you paying those closing costs, the seller has basically done that in this hypothetical scenario. So depends on the market. If it's a very strong buyer's market, that might be an option. If it's a very strong seller's market where there's a lot of competition for you as a buyer, that may not be an option. But that, as I said before, is one of the big reasons that you'll want to work with a real estate agent or a realtor and someone that's high quality that will be able to help you negotiate that in with your offer, because that could reduce the amount of cash that you need to part with when it comes time to sign your paperwork and do the loan closing. So getting the seller to help contribute to closing costs is always a good idea if you can do that, if your goal is to save on your investment or your cash up front. So one quick scenario to just drive home that point. If the seller in this scenario was willing to drop the price down to down to $291 and would give you a $291 price but no help with closing costs, it's pretty much the same as if they were to sell it to you at $300,000 but give you that 3% or $9,000 to help cover your closing costs. So same number to them. It's just a way to accomplish you not having to part with as much cash at the closing of your purchase. So keep that in mind. That can get a little bit confusing, especially if your lender has planned on you doing that and then you don't communicate that with your realtor, or the lender doesn't with your realtor. You could find yourself in a situation where you thought you were only going to bring in X and then you actually need to bring in Y. So have that conversation with your lender up front, especially if you want to keep that cash out of pocket down to a minimum. Second thing that would reduce the amount of cash needed from you would be any help from the South Dakota Housing Development Authority, that program we talked about earlier, with their down payment assistance funds. So If you remember from that video, there's an option there to get 3% down payment assistance or 5% down payment assistance. And all that's talking about is the amount of your loan, that percentage amount in the form of down payment assistance. So it reduces the amount of cash that you're going to need for closing, and ultimately can get you to a spot where you may not even need any cash out of pocket to purchase your first home. So in this scenario, we were at a $300,000 purchase. If we were to take some down payment assistance from South Dakota Housing, that 5% down payment requirement could be all but eliminated with that down payment assistance money. So again, there's definitely options out there to reduce that number. And depending on the program that you're looking at, you may not need to come up with any cash at your loan closing. So that would be the one takeaway I'd want you to get from this video is there is an option there to reduce that number down to be very little, if not anything, out of pocket. So keep that in mind. And then the last thing is what's called a tax proration credit. And that comes automatically from the seller as well. And that probably is the hardest one to make sense of or understand. But basically the thing to know is in South Dakota, we pay our property taxes a year in arrears, meaning we are paying taxes on properties in 2023. We're paying the property taxes that actually accrued in 2022. In 2024, we'll pay the property taxes that accrued in 2023. So when your mortgage is escrowed to pay those taxes and insurance, your mortgage will pay that tax bill whenever it comes up. But when it does come up, it's actually paying the taxes from last year. So to make that right with you as a buyer, you shouldn't have to pay the taxes of the home from when the seller lived in it. So they're going to give you a credit at your loan closing that's going to basically pay their fair share of taxes up until that closing date. So you're paying just your fair share going forward. They're paying their fair share, and it's prorated down to the day. So long story short on that, there's going to be a pretty good size credit that takes place at your loan closing, right on the closing disclosure, that will reduce that number even more. So it is possible in theory that not only could you not have to bring much to closing, but you could actually even get a little bit of cash back and not really need a lot of cash out of pocket at all. So keep that in mind. Taking the down payment, adding the closing costs, and then subtracting out the seller concessions where the seller will help with closing costs, if applicable, the down payment assistance, if applicable, and then the tax proration credit, which is almost always applicable, assuming the home's been in existence and it's not a new construction. So those are things to keep in mind. The only other thing that could really change the amount you will need at your loan closing would be if you chose to or were required to pay anything else at the loan closing. So that would be things like if you needed to pay off a debt or a judgment or a collection to qualify for your mortgage, your lender might have you do that right at the closing table. That would add potentially the amount you need to bring into your closing. But if that doesn't exist, that pretty much nails down everything that would be required. And then if you put any earnest money down with your offer, which we talked about in a previous video here as well, $500, $1,000, whatever that is, that's basically applied to the amount needed at closing, and it'll reduce it down even less. So you could even get some money back then at that point. So I know that sounds maybe a little bit confusing, but again, if you do that simple formula, take your down payment, your closing costs, add those together, subtract out any help from the seller, any down payment assistance, and the tax proration credit, and you should find that total number to be pretty accurate. Any good lender or loan officer should be able to estimate that for you to probably within a couple $100 when you identify a property and be very close, so there's no surprises at the end. So if you've got questions on that, by all means ask, but that should get you close on the amount needed for your loan closing.